The return of Warhammer Fantasy is a great thing. It is something that I myself and many others have been asking for and wishing for ever since Games Workshop decided to axe the franchise that they had ever so slowly been murdering for years. But the first unit announced for this new Warhammer gave me a bit of pause. The Kislev Ice Guard. Now, on the one hand, it is absolutely excellent to see Games Workshop focusing a bit more on one of the smaller factions, like Kislev, a faction that is absolutely ripe for expanding, but it is imperative that if Warhammer is to return, it needs to be as Warhammer Fantasy, and not merely Age of Sigmar Light. And the Kislev Ice Guards are far too magical. They are too fantastical for a nation like Kislev. They strike me far more as the design of a high elf unit, rather than not just even a Kislevite unit, but a human unit in total. I mean, think about it. This is a unit of magical warrior women wielding magical ice weaponry. How many units in the entirety of Warhammer wield magical weapons as standard equipment? Not to mention human units. The closest comparison you would have to this in the form of a fantastical unit would probably be the Grail Knights of Bretonnia, and even then, the Grail Knights are fantastical beneath the armor. They look like mortal men, they look like Knights of Bretonnia, they have merely received the blessing of the lady, whilst the Ice Guard, they are obviously fantastical in their nature. They are covered in magical ice, they wear it around their necks, they use it as decorations for their ridiculous headpieces, and their weapons are all crafted from magical ice. Hell, even their arrow tips are ice. That's a level of magical nonsense that most elf units would find difficult to match. But instead of merely just pointing out all of the things that might be wrong with this design, I figured, let's have a look at how we might make it better. And so I commissioned an artist to make me a piece of an Ice Guard member, the way I would probably have liked to see them, and the way I would probably have tried to design them. Bearing in mind, first and foremost, the inspiration of Kislev, a crazy mix of Polish winged hussars, Tsarist Russia, and a great big fat dollop of feudalism on top. So where do we begin? Well, first and foremost, this is to be a Guard-style unit. Now, there already exists another Guard unit within Kislev, the Kreml Guard, founded by Igor the Terrible. They are talked about in the Warhammer Fantasy RPG book, I believe, and there are no official art of them as far as I am aware, but there are some fan-made illustrations. In this case here, we have one of those of the Kreml Guard, wearing quite heavy armor reminiscent of that used by the winged hussars, and wielding a great big two-handed axe. That does indeed look like a Guard unit, an elite formation wearing heavy armor, since of course their proximity to the court itself would give them access to the finest of gear and weaponry. Additionally, they would almost certainly be wearing the red of the Gospodars, the imperial family, rather than the light blue favored by the boyar families. But I also didn't want to create just a radically new thing because it somewhat defeats the point, so bearing in mind some of the key tenets of the Ice Guard, an all-female unit, alright, so that is going to necessitate some changes. An all-female unit would not be using massive two-handed axes, that's probably not a very good idea. However, they would probably be able to utilize the half-plate of the Kreml Guards quite easily, and they would certainly wish for that extra protection. They would probably also want a way to strike at ranged, which is also in keeping with the design of the Ice Guard. And finally, the whole ice weapon thing. Alright, that could be a good idea, but it needs to be dialed back a bit, and so this is what me and my artist came up with. Here we have an evidently female warrior. She is wearing a light blue cape, to show that she is the daughter of a boyar. She is not enrolled within the Kreml Guard or the Winged Lancers who eschew the colors of their old families. She is a part of the Imperial Household Guard. She is a member of a guard formation, as signified by the amount of red in her appearance as well, but she is separate from the Winged Lancers and the Kreml Guard, who again have completely relinquished their old past as sons of the boyars. This makes them a bit of a different formation, and I also imagine that would fit nicely into their backstory. Why would Kislev start recruiting women into the Imperial Army all of a sudden? Well, we know that Kislev is under a great deal of pressure from the north, from chaos, and in times of extreme need, it doesn't really matter which gender the meat is. All that matters is that the grinder must be fed. And so, the Tsarina sent out the call to recruit the daughters of the boyar families as well, and not merely the sons. But since the boyars are quite fond of their daughters, them having quite a great deal of independence within their families, it was determined that this would be a little bit too offensive. It would piss off too many boyars if they simply enroll them. And so they created a semi-independent unit. They would be the Tsarina own personal guard, bequeathed onto her by the boyar families, rather than outright adopted into the Tsarina's armies. And in return, the Tsarina would bless them in particular. You may notice the spear, it is not made of wholesale ice. Instead, it is merely enchanted with a little touch of ice magic. And for a small elite formation like the Ice Guard, that is absolutely something that would be within the Tsarina's own personal power, and in a completely different scope from creating literal weapons out of magical ice for every single individual, including their bloody arrows. In the case of our Ice Guard, you can notice that she is carrying a quiver on her hip, but they are but normal arrows. This also shows off one of the more prominent members, a sergeant perhaps, and so you can see she has been given the honor of wearing a small piece of enchanted ice on a necklace. A personal gift from the Tsarina, both as a symbol of status and of gratitude. Let's also have a little note about her equipment, shall we? Again, having an all-female unit carrying massive two-handed axes would probably be a rather bad idea, so this example is using a spear instead. I'm imagining a mixed arms formation, almost in a pike and shot style, where the front ranks will be using their enchanted spears. Deadly little things, absolutely. I mean, imagine having little slivers of enchanted ice worm their way into your bloodstream with the slightest cut. That'd be quite nasty in the extreme, and hopefully more than enough to keep the savage northern barbarians at a good arm's length, whilst additional ranks utilizing short, compact bows can then pepper the enemy with arrows. This would result in a very prickly formation, methinks, which would give the female troops the best advantage they could hope for, especially when fighting Chaos Warriors. I mean, hell, they have a habit of making even boyars look small by comparison. And of course, they're going to need some protection, bearing in mind also their weaponry. She is wearing a plate armor helmet, which is offering as much protection as possible, whilst also not impacting her field of view, allowing her to make full use of her bow and arrows. She is also wearing a solid plate form-fitting cuirass, providing protection to the most vulnerable parts of her body, along with strapped pieces of plate protecting her upper and lower arms. She is also wearing a plated leather half-skirt to provide protection to the groin area and some for the legs as well. As for the arms and feet, wearing armored gloves in the cold is not necessarily a fantastic idea, and armored boots too could quickly prove more of a hindrance than a help in heavy snowfall. She is instead wearing thick leathered gloves, which will provide some protection if the enemy tries to pass a weapon down the shaft of her own spear, and then thick furred boots. Lastly, not so much a piece of armor, or at the very least not protection against enemy weaponry, but certainly against the cold, is her large blue cloak, which serves both of a sign of her heritage. These are the noble daughters of the boyar nobility, and not entirely a part of the Tsarina's own armies. And also, if you're going to be wandering that far north, a nice big warm cloak is definitely something you want on your wish list. And so there we are, my version of Games Workshop's Ice Guard. I tried to maintain some of the, more salient points of Games Workshop's idea, even though some of them rub me a little bit the wrong way. The idea of female fighters is not necessarily that bad. Again, if Kislev is pushed hard enough, then sure, absolutely. And Kislev is a relatively equal nation, at least in the far north. The boyar families tend to give their daughters a great deal of liberty, after all. If anything, it's the magical weaponry that annoys me the most. The idea of weapons straight up made of magical ice is too fantastical. Instead, having a piece of jewelry handed out to prominent individuals or an enchantment laid upon more mundane weaponry, even that's pushing it a little bit, but it is more reasonable in my opinion. So, what do you guys think? Please do let me know in the comment section down below, and if you like the idea, or hell, even if you dislike it, go ahead and share it around. Let's get some feedback on this, and maybe, who knows, we might even reach some ears that matter. Until next time, I've been Arch. Thank you all very much for watching, and I hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.